Hello, dear listener. Welcome to the FutureSeeds podcast. I'm your host, Cyprian, and in this show, I explore groundbreaking solutions to our world's unique problems by connecting seemingly unrelated fields such as technology, ecology, community, and spirituality. In this episode, I interviewed Kamea Chayne, the host of the GreenDreamer podcast. Kamea is an eco-activist, author, and podcaster who's released no less than 260 episodes since 2018. GreenDreamer is the closest thing I've found to FutureSeeds. The topics she explores range from climate balance, circular economy, and social justice, all the way to conscious lifestyle, holistic wellness, and self-growth. Through her interviews, Kamea has accumulated tons of knowledge. In this conversation, her and I discuss the roots of our systemic issues and the waves of change taking place in the world at the moment. Hello, Kamea. So nice to have you on the podcast today. How are you going?
Good. Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor. I'm really excited for our conversation.
I'm just going to read for our listeners what you wrote on your description. Baffled by our current path forward that's leading us to ecological destruction, dehumanization, and disconnection from the things that matter most, I inquisitively explore our path towards ecological regeneration, intersectional sustainability, and true abundance and wellness for all. So Kamea, could you please tell me, what was your journey like, personal and professional, that led you to these projects, this podcast and this book and your newsletter?
I'm a third culture kid, so I was born and raised in Taiwan. Most of my family is here. And I've always had a fascination with and love for nature, just watching a lot of National Geographic or Animal Planet and things like that. So as someone that grew up more so in an urban jungle, I was really fascinated by the wildness of what's out there. So throughout my high school years, I would go on these volunteer trips I went to the panda conservation in China and the sea turtle conservation in Osorno, Costa Rica. And those kind of just reaffirmed my passion and love for conservation. But at that stage, I think my love was more of an innocent care. So, I heard about these species going extinct, and that just didn't sound right. So I wanted to see what I could do to help. And I didn't really know the larger picture of what was happening. And then the turning point came for me in college when I studied psychology, environmental studies, and marketing. And at that same time, my freshman year, I went through a period of depression that had me kind of falling for a lot of these consumerist messages by the media and magazines telling me that, if I had this, if I looked like this, I would be happier and healthier and so forth. So as a college student, I, for a while, turned to cheap fast fashion as a way to distract myself from my emotions and to cope. And also because I just had a creative side and loved art, music, design, and style. But I basically, was a part of the fast fashion sphere and would say that I was probably addicted to it for a bit. And a few years later, I picked up a book called The Ecologist's Guide to Fashion by Ruth Stile that collided the two things that I really loved. So at that point, it was fashion and the environment. And I learned things like it takes the equivalent of 3 years of drinking water to grow enough cotton for one single t-shirt. So
wow.
That was just really mind-boggling for me. And also reading about the really high suicide rates for cotton farmers in India because they're always drowning in immense debt. All of this just didn't sound right. And so it was kind of a wake-up call for me that the fashion choices that I have on this side of the world, because of our globalized economy, can have ripple effects to ecosystems elsewhere and also to people elsewhere as well. So that kind of was the impetus for me to start looking into conscious consumerism and how our individual choices, our individual lifestyle choices impact the greater world that we live in. So that was kind of the inspiration for Thrive, in which I kind of took this approach, or I took on these discussions through the lens of wellness, because I felt like when we talk about health, people talk about like sleeping, eating, working out, and things like that. But I felt like we needed to really expand our view on wellness to include environmental health, because I could be doing everything they recommend, so getting enough sleep, eating a balanced diet, getting enough workout every single day, having healthy relationships and stuff. But if the air I were breathing every day were polluted, if the water I'm drinking every day to stay hydrated were polluted, if the whole foods I'm eating were contaminated by agrochemicals, or if the whole foods themselves were depleted in nutrients because of the homogenized varieties that have been grown by corporate agriculture, then I cannot optimize my health because of these larger things at play. So Thrive basically was an exploration of how we can optimize our mental, physical, and environmental health through our individual choices. And then later on, I, of course, started to learn how systemic a lot of our issues are, and how oftentimes the choices that we have as individuals are often dependent on the larger systems. So, of course, it starts to become pretty overwhelming when you think about the larger picture of how these mass-scale issues aren't necessarily things that I can influence as one person. So at that stage, I kind of went into a personal low. All of this is really a lot to learn about, and it's quite depressing. And then I realized that I always felt like I was most activated and inspired whenever I was learning about what other people were already doing and working on to create positive change in the world. And at the same time, I really loved listening to podcasts because they allowed me to learn on the go while I was driving, making breakfast, and so on. So that's when I kind of combined the two and thought, I could interview people who are doing really great things to learn for myself, but also to be able to share these inspiring conversations with others in hopes of being able to help others and get more people inspired and activated as well.
That's amazing. I love the way you think. I'm the same. I want to hear everything that everybody's doing, and hearing about it gives me hope, basically.
Yeah.
As you know, the little gimmick for FutureSeed is planting a different narrative and only interviewing change makers, just like you.
Love that.
When did you start?
I started 2018 May, so it's been just over 2 years.
Wow, you already have 260 episodes out.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I published 3 episodes per week for the entire 2018 and hit episode 100 at the end of that. And then last year, 2019, it was 2 episodes per week for the whole year. So we hit 200 by the end of that, and now we're on track to hopefully hit our 300th episode by the end of this year or early the next.
That's truly unbelievable. How many people you work with?
So it's me pretty much full time, and then I have an audio engineer that helps with cleaning up the episodes and making sure the listening experience is good for people. And I used to do this myself, but it just ended up taking so much of my time when I really was passionate about doing the research and talking to people and doing more of the content portion. So that just made sense for me when I was able to. And then there's also Elizabeth, who is our content manager. She basically helps create the show notes and create social media graphics so we can share some of the highlights of each episode to social media. And both of them are part-time, so...
Yeah, you got to delegate something at some point.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Just for our listeners who don't know GreenDreamer, I'd just like to skim, because you have 300 episodes, 360 episodes. You also classify them by categories.
So, I want to mention that I really don't like categorizing things, but I feel like for ease of people just stumbling upon the show, for them to get an idea of it, because I do think that every issue is interconnected, and I really don't like to label things and categorize things, but I understand that it's helpful for people to be able to
totally get what you mean.
Stuff. So, yeah.
But I want to give the listeners an idea of the scope of what you're talking about. So here are the categories: circular economy, social impact, business, leadership and self-growth, media and communications, policy and activism, justice, regeneration and restoration, wildlife conservation, environmental, climate balance, science and technology, conscious lifestyle, and finally, holistic wellness. So that is a wide scope. My little forewords for FutureSeeds are technology, ecology, community, and spirituality. And I thought that was quite wide already.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of these, I would say all of these things can be encompassed in what you just said. These are just broken down into even smaller categories. But we could also just say
amazing.
Sustainability, and that could define all of these topics also.
Yeah, I love it. But let's get into the topic. The reason why I wanted to have this conversation with you today is that I think that after speaking with 260 change makers, and I guess lots more, you could start seeing patterns of what's happening in the world and the directions they'll be taking and the challenges that we always face. And I just want to ask you this question now. After listening to all those people, what are first the recurring challenges that you can see happening in changing this world, helping this world to go in a different direction? The second question will be, what are the kind of trend of directions that people are taking to change this world that you can see happening?
Yeah, I think it's honestly a challenging question to answer because when you're looking at like 200 conversations, there's just so much depth and breadth within that. In terms of recurring challenges, I feel like a lot of our challenges today in terms of sustainability stem from settler colonialism and colonialism itself. Because basically what you had was a lot of our social injustices today are still being perpetuated, but really started by that time when, people were being dehumanized and told that they were less than and being robbed of their lands, their resources, their food. And of course, we have that same economic and social injustice perpetuated to today that we never really accounted for or that we never really properly addressed. And also in terms of the environment, what we see as the result of colonialism is we have no more strong sense of connection to place. So a lot of people who are immigrants to where they live now or settlers from the colonial settler era, a lot of people and our modern systems have disconnected itself from the native bioregions that these systems exist as one part of. So even when we're talking about sustainability, there are certain things, so like for example, even conservation in the United States itself and elsewhere as well, there were colonial ties to that in that a lot of our national parks were established to protect the land, but to also basically kick off the native peoples that lived within them that were living regeneratively as one part of the ecosystem. So they often were living in ways that were beneficial to the ecosystem because they had a relationship to that place. But the European settlers came in and wanted to mark these places off as quote-unquote pristine wildlife. And because of that, I actually just interviewed a fire historian, Stephen Pine, and he talked about how a lot of our increasing prevalence of wildfires today in part has to do with the ways of conservation of European settlers in how they kind of thought that all fire was bad, so they didn't allow fire to come in, even when fire might have been natural and necessary to helping a certain ecosystem or forest regenerate. So by keeping fires out this whole time, what it's doing is it makes wildfires even more severe whenever they do happen. It makes them more out of control because they might have been happening really infrequently for a long time, but because you've prevented wildfires from coming into this landscape where it was an integral part of, what you're doing is every time a spark occurs and it lights on fire, it's going to be a lot more devastating than it might have been. So that's just one example. So yeah, I would say that a recurring theme that has come up is how when we look to our history, a lot of things stem from our lack of connection to place from colonialism. And in terms of recurring solutions, I do see a lot of people talking about our need to localize, decentralize power, localize our resources, re-indigenize our perspectives, meaning to reestablish reciprocity with our lands that we live on, so that we can better understand what sustainability is. So that's kind of like a big one that I've personally seen as I started from episode 1 to 200. So
that's amazing, because it's similar to what I've seen in the amount of episodes I've already produced. And it's also that I just participated in a debate on capitalism. And studying capitalism shows you how much colonization played a part in building our world, how much it's still part of our world. We here in Australia this year, as you may know, had the most massive fires. And the debate was around the fact that the government was not listening to the indigenous knowledge of how to take care of the forest here. Same story. I've interviewed Helena Norberg Hodge in my episode 7, which is a worldwide environmentalist. She cannot insist enough on how much localization is important as well.
Yeah.
Because she was living in Ladakh when she saw the first road being built and capitalism entering in their country and destroying the whole social structure as well as environmental. So I think you're quite right that we can't even perceive how deep rooted that is and how much it impacted everything in our life and all the problems we're facing today.
Yeah, because that history goes beyond our lifetime right here. It's centuries, hundreds of years. And a lot of times we look at these issues through a very micro and myopic lens without taking a step back to look at how these systems were set up, how a lot of issues have been institutionalized and locked into the system. That makes it really, really hard to change and address.
And you living in USA, not having been in the USA for a few years, but it's very present in your country, all those issues of race, of colonization. The Black Lives Matters movement this year resonated literally in every country around the world.
Yeah, that was actually really powerful to see, that people around the globe were having protests. And I mean, racism at a global level, social injustice at a global level, a lot of that also, again, stem from the era of colonialism when a lot of these power dynamics were completely, set in stone.
Absolutely. Because I've been studying more the economic system we live in, I've understood how much all of this is interlinked and why it's so difficult to understand since we grew up in it as well. But capitalism rose because of colonization, because of building ships and going to America and other places and stealing the resources and murdering the people that were living there. And capitalism at that time relied on slavery heavily. Today, we are still using globalization and delocalization as a way to have cheap labor, as a way for this economic system to function. And
right.
it's all of this is so interlinked, we have trouble even perceiving it.
Yeah.
That's what I think.
And to find cheap labor, but all to benefit the people at the top. Because if we were talking about decentralization, which I think is the only way we can support biodiversity, because biodiversity in every ecoregion is so different. But when these massive multinational corporations want to use, for example, even organic cotton across their entire supply chain for billions of items of clothing, that is going to homogenize landscapes and require farmers to maybe have to convert biodiverse local ecosystems into organic farms of these monocultures in order to feed that demand for the multinational corporation, wanting to sell the same thing to like everybody in the world. So
exactly. So the economic logic that's behind it drives this whole colonization process and this whole destruction process. What are the major changes in the world that you've seen in the last few years, and what change would you like to see happening in the world if you were to describe a dream?
So I feel like, well, certainly as a millennial, my awareness and observation of the world is much smaller compared to people who are a lot more senior than me, who've been globally conscious for much longer. But based on what I've personally seen, I feel like as the impacts of climate change has worsened, as economic disparity within the US and globally as well has worsened, I do feel like more and more people are connecting the dots between our various forms of injustices and, realizing that whether we're talking about worker justice, climate justice, racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice, they all sort of share the same roots of dehumanization and oppression. So hopefully we're on track to expanding and growing this movement so we can come together and collectively point our fingers towards the system rather than at each other. And in terms of what, because also I feel like the media perpetuates this divisiveness and makes people focus on issues that are not related to things that really push people to the brinks on a daily basis, that a lot of people share, whether they're on the left or the right. In terms of what I would like to see happening in the world, because everything really is connected, I think by reframing sustainability to a combination of regeneration and re-Indigenization, that can go a long way in simultaneously addressing a lot of our issues. So health, social justice, conservation, and so forth. So basically because a lot of these issues, like I mentioned, share the same roots, and I see some of those roots including our collective sense of dissociation from nature, so thinking that we are separate to nature and other living creatures, and thinking that humans are superior rather than one part of this planet ecosystem, and therefore natural resources are ours to take and extract and exploit. And also our lack of, as I mentioned earlier, place-based relationship to the places that many of us have immigrated to or have settled on. So I think we need a consciousness revolution, which has to be a starting point before we can roll out the actionable changes that we want to see in the world and be able to shift the society in the direction that we have to go. So I was also interviewing Dr. Luisa Maffei of Terralingua, and their focus is on biocultural diversity. So really connecting the dots between biodiversity loss, linguistics and language loss, and also cultural diversity loss, and showing that these are all interconnected because humans evolved with the landscapes that we were in for so long. And she was talking about how a lot of the political systems that we know of today and learn about, whether we're talking about socialism to communism to whatever else, capitalism, all of these things still fundamentally take on a view that natural resources are ours to take. So it's just about a better management of that resources, but they still share that human-centric and human supremacist view, rather than seeing that we have to integrate ourselves into nature. So maybe we haven't come up with the right political and economic system yet that we need. So as I mentioned earlier, regeneration and re-Indigenization. So regeneration meaning that we have to build a sense of reciprocity with the earth, to see ourselves as one part of the earth, so our actions then follow. And so we're not just talking about buying more organic things, but also talking about how we can support our biodiversity to enrich, rebuild healthy soil, plant more native and pollinator-friendly plants, grow more diverse heirloom foods, and have a more additive and expansive rather than a reductionist mindset to sustainability, and saying we have to do less of this and less of that and so forth. And then on the other hand, re-Indigenizing, meaning we need to support indigenous-led conservation efforts, and also that we need to support, of course, indigenous rights and sovereignty, and that even if we don't personally identify as indigenous today, I think it's important for us to also learn to re-indigenize our perspectives, which in large part means starting to build a sense of place-based relationships to the unique ecosystems that we're a part of. And when we start to do that, we start to see that we can't turn to these generalized top-down ecological impact assessments that tell us, that compare water use, energy use of all these different production methods for different maybe crops or food types, we can't look at these impact assessments to draw conclusions on what is most sustainable, because the answer is really out there in our very specific and unique ecoregions. If we want to work towards localization, we also have to recognize that our Earth is diverse, and we have to look outside rather than to these globalized assessments of averages without the context of place.
Wow. That's what I say. Wow. All right. Well, yes, so 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in indigenous land still, and I think people don't realize that. Where we keep destroying those cultures, and then some people keep insulting them, but they're still protecting us no matter how much harm we do to them. And they know a lot of things that we should listen to, absolutely. And we are only starting to understand how much the knowledge they had was actually safeguarding this world. So absolutely. Do you see a current trend of diverting finances, investments from toxic and unsustainable industries?
I think if we're talking about individual consumer awareness and change, then yes, I think as more and more everyday people learn about these issues, it's hard to just completely tune it out. So I think that if they have easy access, meaning both literal access and affordability, to be able to make better choices in their lives, then they do, and they shift their dollars. If two things are relatively the same price, one, comes from a company that is doing things more responsibly and maybe has a certification, and the other one doesn't, then when it's a simple choice like that, I think people are doing what they can. This is why the secondhand economy we know is growing, why more and more certifications and labels are coming out for conscious consumers to be able to pick apart greenwashing and so forth. And also why large companies are more and more greenwashing their products, because they know that consumers increasingly care and want to spend their dollars this way, so they also want to capitalize off of this. But if we're talking about financial institutions like banks, investment banks, and insurance companies that make a lot of investments that help to shape the global market and the supply and therefore the price and then the demand of certain things, I feel like a small part of it has improved, but for the most part, it's largely stayed the same. So this is from Desmog, March 2019. Since 2016, right after the Paris Agreement's adoption, 33 global banks have poured $1.9 trillion into financing climate-changing projects worldwide. So the top 4 banks that invested most heavily in fossil fuels are all based in the US and include JP Morgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Citi, and Bank of America. Royal Bank of Canada, Barclays in Europe, Japan's MUFG, TD Bank, Scotia Bank, and Mizuho make up the remainder of the top 10. And then on the insurance company side, why that's relevant is because insurance companies invest their customers' premiums that we pay to them in fossil fuel companies. So that's a big part of how they make money. And we know that according to the campaign Insure Our Future, the 40 largest US insurers hold over $450 billion in coal, oil, gas, and electric utility stocks and bonds. So we have very limited options in terms of the insurance companies now that don't invest in fossil fuels, but there are more and more banks that are divesting or maybe were set up to have social and environmental missions or have long committed to not investing in fossil fuels and exploitative businesses. So I feel like conscious consumerism gets a lot of hype on social media. It's very Instagrammable, and how we spend our money is really important. But for people who are able to save money after paying for their necessities, what we keep in our bank accounts is just as important, if not more important. Because imagine if we did everything we could to support conscious consumerism in hopes of shifting the global market, but our collectively greater sums of money we save in our bank accounts or pay to insurance companies ended up passively working against the very goals we're trying to achieve, and ended up continually locking in this system that's skewing the market to artificially cheapen fossil fuels. So that would be counterintuitive. So I say especially for people who are too busy from this fast-paced and dehumanizing economic system that place our worth based on how much we contribute to our GDP. For people who don't have the capacity to get more involved in politics, to completely change their lifestyles and so forth, I would say start by changing where you save your money and the banks that you use, because just as it currently is passively working against us, it can also passively do good just sitting in the bank if we were to choose to bank with financial institutions with social and environmental missions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a funny thing. Like, we, on one side, put so much importance on our one vote that our ballot that we give away for every 4 or 5 years, and then don't put much importance on the actual vote we do with our money. We vote for companies, we vote for behaviors with our money, and we don't really realize that.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, the little nuance there is we also can't entirely rely on voting with our dollars, because by saying that our power is linked to our dollars, that also diminishes how the power we would have would be reflective of our economic injustice. So people with more wealth would have greater power than people who are struggling to get by, who might not be able to, support the companies that they wish to support if they could. So both are important. How we spend our money, how we save our money, and then also the larger systemic changes that we need, but are really hard, but that we need to work on.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you seen the movie 2040?
No, I haven't. I don't think it's come out in the States yet. I think it...
Oh, yeah, they were supposed to launch in the States, and with all the COVID stuff, they delayed. That's right.
I'm very excited, though. Heard great things about it.
Yeah, really good. And I interviewed Damon, who lives next to me.
Oh, interesting. Nice.
Like a few kilometers away. He was saying how they're seeing a bit of success in big institutions divesting from fossil fuel and other toxic investments, except in the US.
We're so behind.
On the good side of things, 83% of millennials will refuse to work for a company that will hurt the environment.
That's really great. Yeah.
So some things are changing.
Yeah, I hope so. And I mean, even when people graduate university, some of the most prestigious jobs that people could get, or at least when I graduated, people were talking about, if you work for Amazon, if you got jobs with JP Morgan, or like all of these big, massive multinational corporations, then that's seen as like you're super smart, you did really well in school, and it's kind of seen as like a positive thing if you get into those places. And of course, they often pay the most because they have the most financial resources. Oh, yeah. So I understand that with people facing so much student debt, they might just want to get out of that debt as soon as possible. And it makes that larger salary a lot more attractive to people that might not be able to carry this much debt for that long. So I understand the struggles that people face in wanting to align their jobs with their values, but finding it hard to do so, or yeah.
It is hard. I, in the past, have quit a corporate job because of my values and who I was working for, and it wasn't an easy decision, for sure. Because it's part of the categories as well of podcast, did you interview a lot of people who were mentioning structural, political, and policy changes that would make a big difference?
I don't think it's smart to sugarcoat the reality and believe that we can rely on the government to take us towards sustainability and social justice. So I really think we have to build power away from the political system itself while we stay politically active. This means not just casting a vote in November and then going back to our regular lives thinking that, that will solve our problems. I think this means working towards greater food sovereignty with more victory gardens if we have space for that, or if we have windowsills and things like that, community gardens, building community and community-based self-reliance. Again, like you mentioned, localization of our resources and economy. So basically, we need systemic and structural change, but I think we can also achieve that through building our community-based resilience to the point where we don't have to be at the mercy of the government if we have one another and the ability to meet most of our basic needs ourselves with a true form of security. So it's another way to shift our power dynamics, because as we move down that path, we can sort of starve out the current monopolies and corporate powers that people hate but still rely on today. And I know it won't be easy given that so many people are already pushed to the edge and don't have extra time, but just some things to think about in terms of what we can work more on.
I would like to know what you think about the Green New Deal.
So, well, I know that it's more of a vision rather than dictating how we're going to get there. So I think if people really look in, so I have to be honest, I haven't read through the entire thing, but from my understanding of it from the guests that I've interviewed that talk about it, it's this vision that we can all agree on. We have to shift away from fossil fuels, build a green new economy that also keeps in mind social injustice and can address that at the same time, because all of these issues are connected, and make sure that people that are working in the fossil fuel industry aren't left behind. So I think the vision is something that is hard to disagree with, because it aims to help people, improve people's health, green the economy, and support environmental protection much more than our current system. But for some reason, it's been really politicized to the point where people hear that and will automatically associate that with certain things. And
with what? What do you think is happening in people's mind to be against things like the Green New Deal?
I think it's media brainwashing. I think it's, people... I mean, most people are not going to dig through the actual Green New Deal to read what it actually means, and to get their information from the primary source itself. Most people are going to listen to people that they trust, listen to media outlets that they like listening to. So when you have pundits on TV, maybe on the Republican side that are that automatically feel like the Green New Deal is repulsive, or they have this sort of aversion to it right away, then people that watch those news outlets are going to kind of mimic those same sorts of reactions, because they feel like, oh, if these people think this way, then yeah, I agree with them most of the time. So that's probably how I feel too. And it just becomes kind of the accepted public opinion. But they actually don't even lay out the specific policies or what you're going to do to get there. And I feel like that's when the true differences might come in, because a lot of times people agree on the overarching goal, but really differ in terms of how we get there. But that's a matter of discussion. We can talk about the how in a very productive way, and people can disagree. We can, work on that together, hash out the details, make sure everyone's voices are heard, and still work towards this vision that should be a plus for most people.
Yeah, it's funny. Almost every episode, I end up speaking about the massive disinformation campaigns on so many different topics. At the moment, the information war and disinformation programs are just so present during COVID. It's so difficult. You hear everything and it's contrary. And I think this is something that in our world will have to be addressed in a very different way, because it's causing havoc on the world. It was Damon Gameau from 2040 who told me that the fossil fuel industry spent $1 billion on disinformation, on spreading false information about climate change.
Yeah. And what I learned from Barbara Fries, who I interviewed, she's the author of I don't remember the name of her book, but it basically has to do with, she looked at the history of disinformation campaigns from the tobacco industry to the slave trade to the fossil fuel industry. But basically what she said is that even if some fossil fuel companies today will say, yeah, we agree, we know that climate change is happening and we know that it's caused by human activity and we have to change, even if they accept that reality today, because they've spent decades pushing this disinformation out, people are still impacted by that history, decades of disinformation already put out there. So even if today they will agree that, yes, it's an issue, we have to work on it, they've already put the damage out there. And people are already, using what they said 10 years ago as, look, like they said this. So yeah, just because they agree with it today doesn't mean that they haven't already done a lot of harm by pushing out those disinformation campaigns.
Oh, yeah. And they're not going to stop as well. What would you say about the role of media in all of this, and in particular the role of podcasting?
So this is another big one. We know that in the United States, and I think this general picture is true globally as well, but in the US, the number is 90% of media is controlled by just 6 corporations. So while traditional journalists and reporters themselves may all be doing their best in maintaining integrity in what they do, it's really the larger forces that's shaping the media landscape that influence our dominant narratives that is problematic, because the media is so powerful in shaping public opinion and in shaping public awareness on certain issues. So I'm not sure if you've heard of Noam Chomsky and his work called Manufacturing Consent. But basically, this talks about how the media sphere is shaped through multiple filters due to how they operate, which results in a lot of media really becoming state media rather than a check on power like it should be. And the media, government, and corporations really feed into each other to uphold this entire media industrial complex system, because they benefit off of their relationships with one another. So just as a brief overview, it's really expensive to run media companies. So most traditional media companies rely on ad dollars from large corporations. And that often leads to self-censorship in the corporate media world because they don't want to upset their corporate sponsors. And where it's not so much that individual reporters might be lying to the public and twisting how they actually feel, but more so that the people who already believe in things and have opinions that are friendly to the corporations, they tend to get promoted. And the people who speak truth to power and dissent and say things that upset those in power, they're often sidelined or, placed elsewhere in the media company, because the company has to maintain generally good relationships with the corporate world so that they can continue to exist because they rely on them. And then people generally already know the issue of corporate interests corrupting our government, so I won't go into that. But between media corporations and the government, the media needs to be able to secure access to important interviews with the most notable people in the political landscape. Also to be able to feed this content to their audience and keep them engaged. And when you're a journalist or reporter, when you have a journalist or reporter that wants to challenge this established status quo and ask really tough questions, specifically regarding why our politics, whether left or right, hasn't been working for the everyday people and haven't been working for the working class, lower income people. If you get lucky to have one of these interviews, working with a major media company with access to these politicians, but you upset them and you upset their political organization by being too harsh, then your media company probably won't be happy with you because you might jeopardize the network's future opportunities to get access to the political elites. So it's just a very general overview, and I really recommend watching. There's a short 5-minute video on YouTube that goes through the filters of manufacturing consent. It's an animation video, so just search for manufacturing consent and it should show up. But anyway, in conjunction with how the media influences the public opinion and discourse so much, this is why it's so important for people to listen to and read more content from independent outlets, like independent podcasts like yours and mine. Because by being independent, meaning not run by corporate media networks or relying on corporate sponsors, we can discuss whatever we want to discuss without being held back and without those filters affecting us. So we usually are able to offer more information that have been sidelined by mainstream media and perspectives that also have been marginalized and that I think better reflect the reality of what's happening in the world. So I think independent media outlets like ours are absolutely crucial. And because it takes so much work to produce research and publish this content, And most of us reject taking ad dollars from exploitative corporations that have benefited the most financially from this extractive system. I think it's really important for people to not passively consume content from independent outlets, but to actively engage, actively share this content. And if you have the financial means to, actively support them financially, even if it's just $1 or $2. I think this is part of what we need to do in order to reclaim the dominant narratives that have been so long skewed towards the interests of the corporate world.
You have 260 episodes out, and I'm going to ask you a bit of a difficult, tricky question. Which is your favorite?
Oh,
which one you think people should really, really listen to, or list 3 of them maybe?
Yeah, can I name a couple?
Yeah.
So, favorite might not be the right word for me because it's not necessarily my personal favorite, but things that are relevant to what we just discussed in this episode that I feel like are really pertinent and crucial. As an example, Sean Sherman of The Sioux Chef, he runs a nonprofit and they're working to re-identify Native American foods and redefine North American cuisine. So basically in the US, you can go to any major city and be able to dine at restaurants of cuisines from all over the world. But you can't find cuisines from right here, native foods from right here. What did the Native Americans eat in New York when they were in that area or on the West Coast? You can't really find a lot of restaurants like that. So they're working to, like I mentioned, re-identify Native American foods and redefine North American cuisine. And I think that's really important for us to be able to understand what sustainability looks like in the United States. Not these food systems that came in and took over the landscape after the settler colonizers came in without any understanding of what grows best here or what is most regenerative for this landscape. So that's one. Soulfire Farm by Leah Penniman. That's a people of color-led agricultural project working to dismantle institutionalized racism in food. So also another really important discussion, and their work is incredible. And then also just any of the other ones focused on regeneration. I'm just going to shout a few. So Kiss the Ground, Regenerative Organic Alliance, Ecosystem Restoration Projects, which is cool. They basically have these eco-restoration camps in different parts of the world that instead of going camping, you can go attend one of their restoration camps, maybe with friends and family, and support the actual work of regenerating and restoring land. So I think that's really cool. Like they did some projects with places devastated by wildfires to help to rebuild the community and rebuild the soils and help the ecosystems recover. So just some off the top of my mind.
Yeah, it's hard.
How people can get involved directly.
Beautiful. And if I was to ask you, what's the most impactful message you've ever heard from one of your speakers? Does something pop to your mind?
I honestly grow and learn from every single episode. So again, these most questions are really hard for me to answer, but I will say this quote that one of my guests shared as his favorite quote really stuck with me when he said it. So the quote is by Howard Thurman, and it goes, "Don't ask yourself what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive, and then go do that. Because what the world needs is people who have come alive." So I feel like faced with so many issues, a lot of us know very well what we're against, and we approach our work with this sort of energy of what we're fighting. But because we have to sustain ourselves long term, it might be hard to do that when we're doing this work out of feeling forced to do it rather than feeling like this is my purpose, my passion, my calling. This is why this matters to me and the people that I love. And connecting that with the things that we enjoy doing or are skilled at or where our talents lie, whether that's writing, art, music, science, business, or something else. So to remember why this work is important to us, and to be working towards a vision of what we want rather than doing this work out of seeing it as a fight and running away from something.
I just love talking about meaning and purpose and calling. What has it done to you to start GreenDreamer?
That's another big one too.
But because I can feel that's your calling. You feel at ease in this project and thriving. And 2-3 years ago, you didn't have GreenDreamer in your life.
I feel like I knew I was interested, and I feel like I really grew into doing this work, and I grew while doing this work, obviously. So because it's something that I feel so passionate about, it doesn't really feel like work to me. So I know a lot of people have what they call work-life balance, but for me, it's just life. It's things that I care about. So even when I'm not working, I'm reading things on related topics that might add to future conversations. So I feel like it's made my life feel more whole and like it's one, rather than compartmentalizing different parts of my life. And at a personal level, of course, I feel a lot more fulfilled. If I weren't doing this, I would probably be depressed. So even though I spend so much time on this, it's because I love doing it. I'm really passionate about it. I feel called to do it. Of course, thinking about these issues, these grand issues, can be debilitating for our mental well-being and for our emotional health. But at a personal level of, being able to do this as my work, I feel grateful that I feel grateful and privileged to be able to work on what I love.
It feels good, I know. Is GreenDreamer mainly funded by Patreon?
At this stage, it is.
Right, so it is exactly what you're describing now.
Yeah, so I'm working towards it. We still take on some sponsors, some very aligning sponsors occasionally, but I'm working towards hopefully a completely community-powered show, and that takes time. So I don't ever shame other influencers or media creators for working with this system that we have, because it's really hard to be quote unquote ethically pure and sustainable with our choices.
Absolutely.
So just do our best.
Did you get a lot of people getting involved and engaged in your conversations, listeners and CEOs and NGOs, and has it steered a lot of, attracted a lot of people who I'm in?
I would say definitely. At this point, I think we have listeners in 195 countries or 200 across the world. So it's global at this point. And from the feedback that I get from, seeing people's comments on social media, I feel like I hope it's making a positive impact and getting to, really shift a lot of the mainstream discourses on sustainability to have a more holistic and multidisciplinary view.
I definitely impacted me. Love listening to your podcast.
Thank you. That means a lot.
This is the end of our interview, and I'd like to give you a minute, like I do at the end of each of my interview, to send a message to the world. If you had 1 minute to say anything to our listeners now, what would it be?
I think it really starts from you. So a lot of times, we're talking about how we need systemic change, and that can feel very distant and very overwhelming. But the little things that you do at a local level to build your personal well-being, your community well-being, that can really go a long way in helping to shift the power dynamics and create structural change in our society, like we discussed earlier. So if you can, of course, start by just taking really good care of yourself and ensure that you're at the top of your game so you can think clearly and be, really creative in coming up with solutions. And then do what you can to connect with your local ecosystem. Learn what plants are native to where you are. See if you can grow some in the space that you have, whether it's a garden or just a windowsill. Begin to just reconnect with your bioregional landscape. I think that would be just a great start to working towards reconnection, regeneration, re-indigenizing our perspectives, and ultimately sustainability and a better world for everybody.
Thank you so much, Kameas. Thank you for this conversation and all your amazing replies. I loved it. So knowledgeable.
Thank you. Just learned a lot from all the incredible people on the show.
Yeah, I know that feeling. It feels great to have a podcast. Thanks so much. Speak soon.
Thank you. You too.
The FutureSeeds podcast is a project that is supported by its community of listeners. If you like the show and what it stands for, I invite you to head to www.futureseeds.news, where you can support the show for just $2 a month, be part of the FutureSeeds community, connect with its amazing members and speakers, and enable this podcast to thrive. I thank you for your time and hope you enjoy the show and its exploration of alternative solutions to the world's greatest challenges.